The executive, a man whose heart was as barren as the desert he had chosen, refused to provide money for his own mother's medication. To him, old age was a burden, and illness an excuse. With calculating coldness, he dragged her onto the scorching desert floor, tying her under the merciless sun so she would learn her lesson. The sand burned, the air shimmered with heat, and the mother, frail and disoriented, felt life draining away, but the desert held its own protectors. A matriarch elephant with ancestral wisdom in her eyes emerged from the dunes. With surprising delicacy, almost surgical care, she broke the ropes that bound the elderly woman. And then, with the silent fury of a force of nature, the matriarch turned to the son's luxury car, a symbol of his wealth and cruelty. With a single powerful movement, she flung it down the dune as if it were an insignificant toy, leaving it in pieces, a resounding warning in the desert's silence. The metallic crash echoed through the valley, a cry of pain from an inanimate object that moments before represented the pinnacle of power and arrogance. Victor, the executive, watched his luxury car, his sanctuary of control and opulence, tumble down the dune, spinning like a discarded toy. Every dent, every shard of flying glass was a direct blow to his petty soul. The silence that followed was not one of peace, but of brutal shock, broken only by the rustle of sand still sliding down the slope. He blinked, his vision blurred not by the sun, but by disbelief. This couldn't be happening. His car, an untouchable symbol of his status, reduced to a twisted, useless carcass. Rage bubbled in his chest, a blind fury that quickly morphed into icy terror. His eyes, once full of scorn, now widened, fixed on the colossal creature that remained impassive just a few feet from where his mother lay. The matriarch elephant, with the dignity of a queen, showed no sign of exhaustion or remorse. Her eyes, deep and ancient, fixed on Victor with an intensity that made him step back. There was no fury in them, only a cold determination, the same that had guided her trunk to break the ropes and hurl the car. She was the personification of desert justice, a primordial force awakened by human cruelty. The mother, still frail but now free, watched the scene with a mixture of dread and strange serenity. Physical pain still gnawed at her, but the presence of the grey giant was a balm for her wounded soul. Slowly, with the gentle help of the elephant's trunk supporting her, she managed to sit up, the hot sand still burning, but her son's threat for now neutralized. The desert, which had once seemed like hell, now revealed an improbable protector. Victor, on the other hand, felt the ground vanish beneath his feet. His phone, his wallet, everything was in the smashed car. He was alone, unarmed, and just a few feet away, his mother was under the guard of a creature that had just demonstrated devastating strength. The sun, which he had once used as a weapon, now became his tormentor, beating mercilessly on his head, reminding him of the desert's vastness and indifference. Cold sweat trickled down his forehead, mixing with the dust. He gazed at the horizon, searching for any sign of civilization, but found only endless dunes, undulating under the scorching heat. The silence was oppressive, punctuated only by the buzzing of insects and the distant sound of the wind. That desert, which he thought he could dominate with his wealth, now swallowed him in its immensity. He tried to speak, but his throat was dry, his voice failing. The image of his mother, protected by the elephant, was a mirror of his own helplessness. For an instant, he considered running to the car, trying to retrieve something, but the matriarch's gaze stopped him. There was an invisible line, a barrier of respect and power he dared not cross. The message was clear. His mother was under her protection, and any hostile movement would be met with the same fury that destroyed his vehicle. Thirst began to tighten its grip, a sensation he rarely experienced in his life of luxury and convenience. The heat was unbearable, and shade was an unattainable luxury. He, the man who controlled empires, who dictated the fate of others, was now a mere speck in the landscape, at the mercy of the elements and the will of a wild creature. The lesson he wanted to teach his mother about the harshness of life was now being brutally taught to himself. Time dragged on, each minute feeling like an hour. Victor felt despair growing, a knot tightening in his stomach. He was trapped, a prisoner of his own cruelty, with the sun as his jailer and the elephant as his judge. The irony was bitter, almost unbearable. He had dragged his mother to certain death, and now death seemed to stalk him in every dune, in every gust of hot wind. Night was approaching, and with it the even greater dangers of the desert. Without water, without shelter, without communication, his survival was a matter of hours, not days. The matriarch, with her ancestral wisdom, seemed to understand this perfectly, watching him with a patience that promised a long and relentless judgment. The sun, once a merciless executioner, now began its slow descent, painting the sky with shades of orange and purple that, in any other circumstance, Victor would have ignored from inside his air-conditioned car. But there, under the watchful eye of the matriarch elephant, every fading ray of light was a reminder of the approaching darkness, and with it, the unspeakable dangers of the desert night. The sand, which had burned during the day, began to release its accumulated heat, but Victor knew the temperature would drop drastically, transforming the daytime inferno into a frozen purgatory. Thirst was a burning ember in his throat, a constant torture that intensified with every minute. He licked his cracked lips, tasting the metallic tang of despair. His body, accustomed to comforts and conveniences, was already showing signs of collapse. His head throbbed, his vision blurred, and the strength that once propelled him in boardrooms now abandoned him, leaving him at the mercy of overwhelming exhaustion. The elephant, an imposing silhouette against the twilight, did not move a muscle. Her eyes, which seemed to absorb the last light of day, remained fixed on Victor, a silent and relentless sentinel. There was no explicit hatred, only a cold resolve, the patience of a mountain that had witnessed centuries of births and deaths. The mother, still frail but now with a thread of dignity restored, watched her son. In her gaze there was no triumph, only a profound sadness, the pain of seeing the seed of her own flesh rot in cruelty. The elephant's trunk, with an almost imperceptible touch, supported her, offering a comfort Victor had never given her. The contrast was brutal, the sun's coldness against the beast's gentleness, human arrogance against the ancestral wisdom of nature. With the last vestiges of light disappearing behind the dunes, the desert transformed. Sounds, previously muffled by heat and wind, now gained a sinister clarity. The distant howl of a coyote, the rustle of dry bushes, the insistent buzz of nocturnal insects, each sound was a nail in the coffin of Victor's sanity. He tried to move, to seek shelter, but the matriarch made a subtle movement with her head, a silent warning that paralyzed him. The message was clear. He could not flee, could not hide. He was on trial, and the desert was the court. Fear, once an uncomfortable pang, now became a suffocating embrace, chilling his bones despite the residual warmth of the sand. Night brought not only cold, but an almost total darkness, punctuated only by the distant gleam of stars that seemed to mock his insignificance. Victor was completely disoriented. His internal compass, accustomed to GPS maps and city lights, was useless there. He could feel the elephant's presence, a dark, living mass a few feet away, her heavy, constant breathing a terrifying reminder of her power. His mother, enveloped in the giant's shadow, seemed safer than he, the man who had abandoned her. The irony was a slow poison, corroding his soul. He, the predator, was now the prey, stripped of everything that defined him, his money, his status, his control. Thirst became a physical agony. His throat scraped, his tongue swelled. He tried to swallow, but there was no saliva. Hallucinations began, shadows dancing on the dunes, voices whispering in his ears. He saw his mother's face, not as it was now, but from years ago, when she still looked at him with pride, before greed transformed him. Remorse, an emotion he thought he had eradicated, tried to infiltrate, but was quickly crushed by panic. He had no time for regrets. He needed to survive. But how? Without water, without food, without shelter, and under the watchful eye of a creature that seemed to embody nature's very vengeance. The matriarch, with her millennia-old patience, seemed to know the desert would do its work. She didn't need to attack. Her mere presence, the implicit threat in her gaze and strength, was enough. Victor was caught in his own trap, a prisoner of his cruelty. Every cold gust of wind that hit him was a reminder of his vulnerability, every nocturnal sound an omen. The night was long, and the promise of a new day seemed a distant, unattainable mirage. He closed his eyes, but the images of his destroyed car and the elephant's wise eyes haunted him. The desert, which he thought he had conquered, now consumed him, piece by piece. Under the watchful eye of his grey guardian, night advanced, and with it, Victor's mask of civility and control crumbled under the weight of brutal reality. The desert cold, an invisible and relentless enemy, penetrated his bones, making him tremble uncontrollably. He tried to curl up to find some warmth in the rapidly cooling sand, but every movement was agony. Thirst was now an excruciating physical pain, sandpaper in his throat that made breathing an effort. His lips were cracked and bleeding, and his tongue, swollen, felt like a stone in his mouth. Hallucinations intensified, no longer mere dancing shadows, but vivid and terrifying figures. He saw specters approaching from the dunes, hearing mocking laughter that seemed to echo from his own past. Voices of people he had crushed in his ascent. His mother's face, young and smiling, mingled with the look of scorn she had cast upon him moments before. Remorse, once a distant whisper, now screamed in his mind, but it was a scream muffled by the panic and thirst that consumed him. The matriarch elephant, a dark and silent mountain, remained a few feet away, her presence an anchor of terror in the chaotic landscape of his mind. Her eyes, even in the darkness, seemed to glow with an ancient intelligence, observing Victor's every spasm, every desperate attempt to protect himself from the cold and fear. She needed no words. Her mere existence was a judgment. His mother, nestled under the giant's protection, seemed to have found a peace Victor would never know. The elephant's trunk occasionally touched her with surprising delicacy, a gesture of comfort that contrasted violently with the cruelty Victor had shown. He tried to call out, to scream for help, but his voice was a mere hoarse whisper swallowed by the immensity of the night. The desert, once a backdrop for his whims, was now a hungry monster, ready to devour him. The distant howl of a jackal cut through the silence, a primal sound that made Victor jump, his heart pounding uncontrollably against his ribs. He looked around, desperate for any sign of physical threat, but the true threat was invisible. Dehydration, hypothermia, the madness settling in. The irony was a slow poison. He, the man who considered himself the apex of evolution, the supreme predator in the business world, was now reduced to a pathetic creature, at the mercy of the elements and the will of an animal. His billions, his empire, his influence, all were useless there. There was no cell signal, no rescue helicopter, no lawyers to negotiate his release. Nature did not care about his status. A shiver ran through his body, not just from the cold, but from the chilling realization of his utter helplessness. He, who had always controlled everything, now couldn't even control his own bladder. The humiliation was profound, but thirst and fear were stronger. He crawled a few inches, searching for a rock, anything that could serve as shelter, but the sand was infinite and empty. The elephant made no move, only watched him, like a judge observing the defendant in his final plea. With each passing hour, hope diminished. The sun, which he so hated, was now a distant promise of warmth, of life. But he knew morning would bring an intensification of thirst, the relentless burning of the star. Night was a purgatory, but day promised an even greater hell. He closed his eyes, trying to ward off the disturbing images, but the inner darkness was even more terrifying. He saw his mother's face, not as it was now, but from her youth, when she held him in her arms, singing lullabies. A solitary tear rolled down his dusty face, not of genuine remorse, but of self-pity, of despair for his own condition. The matriarch, with her ancestral wisdom, seemed to read Victor's soul. She knew the desert didn't need her trunk to punish. The vastness itself, the oppressive silence, the biting cold, and the burning thirst were more effective executioners. She was merely the witness, the guardian of the justice unfolding. The mother, in turn, felt her body weakened, but her mind was clearer than ever. She watched her son not with anger, but with a profound sadness. The pain of a mother seeing her own flesh and blood lost to darkness. Victor tried to stand, staggering, his muscles protesting. He needed water, he needed help, but where to go? In what direction? The desert was an endless labyrinth, and each dune seemed identical to the last. He took a step, then another, but the elephant made a subtle movement with her head, a silent warning that made him stop. He was trapped, a fly in a web, observed by the patient predator. Despair morphed into bitter acceptance, a forced surrender to the elements and the creature judging him. The night was long, and the promise of a new day seemed only the promise of new torture. He fell to his knees in the cold sand, his body trembling, his mind on the verge of collapse, under the watchful eye of the matriarch, who awaited the desert's final verdict. Night, a heavy and merciless cloak, tightened its icy embrace around Victor. Every fiber of his being cried out for warmth, for water, for an end to that silent torture. The desert cold, which he had once considered a mere inconvenience, was now an invisible executioner, penetrating his bones, making him tremble uncontrollably. His teeth chattered together in a frantic rhythm, a sound that mingled with the buzzing in his ears, a prelude to collapse. He tried to curl up, to seek illusory warmth in the sand that cooled with every minute, but the desert offered no refuge. Thirst, truly, was the queen of his torment. It was no longer a simple dryness, but a tearing pain. Sandpaper in his throat that made every breath an excruciating effort. His lips, long cracked and bleeding, now looked like pieces of parched leather. His tongue, swollen and rough, was a stone in his mouth, preventing any attempt to swallow. He could taste the metallic tang of his own blood, mixed with the dusty scent of the sand and the distant smell of some carcass, a grim reminder of the food chain of which he now seemed the weakest link. Remorse, once a distant whisper, now screamed in his mind, but it was a scream muffled by the panic and thirst that consumed him. There was no room for genuine regret, only for the despair of his own condition. He hated himself not for his actions, but for being there, stripped bare, vulnerable. His mother, nestled under the giant's protection, seemed to have found a peace Victor would never know. The elephant's trunk occasionally touched her with surprising delicacy, a gesture of comfort that contrasted violently with the cruelty Victor had shown. He could hear the low, soothing murmur the elephant emitted, a sound that calmed his mother, but to Victor sounded like distant thunder, an omen. The irony was a slow poison corroding his soul. He, the man who considered himself the apex of evolution, the supreme predator in the business world, was now reduced to a pathetic creature at the mercy of the elements and the will of an animal. His billions, his empire, his influence, all were useless there. There was no cell signal, no rescue helicopter, no lawyers to negotiate his release. Nature did not care about his status. With each passing minute, the darkness deepened, not just in the sky, but within him. Victor, huddled in the cold sand, felt his body shutting down limb by limb. The uncontrollable trembling gave way to a painful rigidity, his muscles protesting against the exhaustion and the cold that seeped into his very bones. His mind, once a whirlwind of hallucinations and self-pity, now swung between peaks of panic and a dangerous stupor, a kind of forced surrender to the abyss. He tried to focus on something, anything, but the black vastness above and around was a vacuum that sucked away his consciousness. Then, a thin thread, an imperceptible change in the sky's hue. The absolute blackness began to yield to a deep navy blue, almost imperceptible at first, but gradually expanding at the edges of the horizon. It was the promise of a new day, the same promise he feared. The pre-dawn cold, which seemed to have lasted an eternity, slowly began to recede, replaced by a warm, deceptive breeze, the harbinger of the approaching inferno. Victor felt the first ray of light touch his skin, a soft prick, almost an ironic kiss from the sun he knew would soon turn into a relentless burn. His eyes, swollen and aching, opened with difficulty. The landscape that revealed itself was as desolate as the darkness of night, but now with brutal clarity. Dunes upon dunes, stretching as far as the eye could see, an endless sea of sand. There was no sign of life, no hope, only the confirmation of his insignificance. Thirst, which had been a searing pain, was now a constant and oppressive presence, a weight in his throat, a fire in his stomach. His lips were completely cracked, his tongue swollen and rough as sandpaper. Every breath was an effort, a scratch in his dry throat. The matriarch elephant, who had spent the night as a shadowy statue, now stood out against the sunrise, her silhouette majestic and imposing. Her eyes, once mere points of light in the darkness, now gleamed with an intensity Victor could not decipher. There was no anger, no triumph, only a serene, almost impassive observation. She was the personification of nature, indifferent to human dramas, yet at the same time the guardian of an ancestral justice. His mother, still nestled under the giant's protection, seemed to have slept. Her face, marked by time and illness, was serene, a peace Victor envied with profound bitterness. He watched her, and for the first time he saw not just the woman he had abandoned, but the mother of his childhood, the woman who loved him unconditionally. A pang of something resembling remorse, but quickly stifled by the despair of his own condition, shot through his chest. He still saw himself as the victim, not the perpetrator. The sun rose quickly, and with it, the temperature. The warm, pre-dawn breeze transformed into a hot, dry breath, carrying with it the scent of dust and desolation. The sand, once cool and welcoming, began to heat up, radiating a warmth that promised to be unbearable. Victor tried to move again, the fixed idea of finding water, of escaping. He dragged his body a few inches, his muscles protesting with painful spasms. With each movement, the sand seemed to cling to him, a heavy burden that prevented him from advancing. The elephant made a subtle movement with her trunk, a gesture that was not threatening, but carried the authority of a warning. Victor stopped, exhausted, his mind clouded. He knew it was no use. She wouldn't let him go. He was trapped, not by ropes, but by the unwavering will of that creature and the immensity of the desert. The irony was cruel. He, who had tied up his own mother, now found himself bound by a greater, invisible, and irresistible force. Hallucinations returned with the daylight, more vivid, more terrifying. He saw the luxury car, his symbol of power and status, tumbling down the dune, a broken toy. He saw the faces of his enemies and victims, all laughing, pointing at him, the cruel executive reduced to a worm in the sand. The sweat, which he could barely produce, evaporated instantly, taking with it the last drop of moisture from his body. He closed his eyes again, but the inner darkness was now a furnace, a cauldron of torment. The sun, which had once been a distant promise of life, Now was the executioner, burning him inside and out. He could feel his skin tighten, his throat closing, his body draining. The matriarch, with her millennia-old wisdom, observed the unfolding judgment. She did not need to act. The desert, with its silent and relentless cruelty, was doing its work. Victor, the man who thought himself above all, was now at the mercy of everything, awaiting the final verdict of the sun, the thirst, and the sand that slowly consumed him. The day, which he had hoped would bring an end to the night's torture, revealed itself as a new and more brutal hell. The sun, now at its zenith, was an incandescent disk in the cloudless sky, a relentless hammer beating down on Victor's head. Each beat was a wave of heat that penetrated him, drying him from within, slowly cooking him. His eyes, once merely swollen, burned as if sand were being rubbed into them, and his vision blurred and focused on distorted patterns in the shimmering sand. Thirst, already a torment, transformed into a physical agony that dominated every fiber of his being. His mouth was a miniature desert, his tongue a piece of dried leather that barely fit in his cavity. He tried to swallow, but there was no saliva, only a painful scratch that descended his throat, a constant reminder of his disgrace. He dragged himself, using his elbows and knees, his skin burning in contact with the scorching sand. Every inch was a battle, a minuscule victory against the exhaustion that threatened to swallow him. The idea of water was a feverish obsession, a constant mirage that danced at the periphery of his vision. He saw shimmering lakes, ice-cold water bottles, even the tap water from his New York penthouse flowing freely. He reached out, his trembling fingers trying to grasp nothing, frustration adding another layer to his torture. The matriarch, the silent giant, did not move. She remained there, a mountain of flesh and wisdom, her shadow cast over the mother, who now seemed to breathe more regularly. The elephant watched Victor with disarming calm, her deep, ancient eyes seeming to see through his facade, straight into his corroded soul. There was no hatred in her gaze, only the coldness of a judge who had already passed sentence and now awaited execution. To Victor, that gaze was more terrifying than any physical threat. It was proof of his insignificance, of his failure to understand the world beyond his own terms. Hallucinations intensified. He heard voices, whispers from his former employees, from his competitors, all mocking his downfall. He saw his mother, not the sick and frail woman, but the young and vibrant one he had forgotten, now pointing at him with disapproval, tears streaming down her face. Guilt, which he had always known how to bury under layers of arrogance and power, began to emerge. Not as genuine remorse, but as an unbearable weight, a new form of mental torture. He thrashed, trying to ward off the images and sounds, but they were relentless, born from his own tormented mind. His body began to fail in more alarming ways. The muscles in his legs and arms contracted in uncontrollable spasms, the pain sharp and sudden. His head throbbed and dizziness was constant, making the world spin in an indistinct blur. He tried to scream, but his voice was a hoarse, almost inaudible squeak lost in the vast silence of the desert. The irony of his situation was a slow poison. He, who had tied up his mother to teach her a lesson, was now immobilized by a much greater force, a lesson nature was giving him with a cruelty he never imagined. His mother, under the elephant's protective shadow, slowly opened her eyes. She looked at Victor, not with the anger or pain he expected, but with a profound sadness, almost pity. Her dry lips moved, and a weak, almost inaudible whisper escaped. "Victor, my son." Her voice, even so faint, pierced the veil of his madness, a ray of lucidity amidst the chaos. For an instant, just a brief instant, Victor saw himself through her eyes, not the magnate, but the lost and frightened boy he had become. A wave of shame, hot and overwhelming, hit him, more painful than the scorching sun. He tried to crawl towards her, a desperate impulse for redemption, for forgiveness, for anything that could alleviate his agony, but the elephant made a subtle movement with her trunk, a gesture that was not threatening, but established an invisible and insurmountable barrier. She would not allow him to approach, not yet. The desert's justice needed to be served. Victor fell back onto the sand, his forehead hitting with a dull thud. The physical pain was almost a relief compared to the pain of rejection, of understanding that he had crossed a line that not even his mother in her fragility was willing to ignore. Time became an abstraction. Hours dragged like days, minutes like centuries. The sun began its slow descent, tinging the sky with shades of orange and purple, a cruel beauty Victor could barely register. The temperature, though still high, began to drop, but the relief was minimal. Dehydration had already done its work, and his body was collapsing. He could feel his irregular heartbeat, a faint, erratic drum in his chest. His mind, once so sharp and calculating, was now a dense fog, punctuated by flashes of panic and despair. He closed his eyes, seeking darkness, but the images persisted. He saw the luxury car, his symbol of power, being flung like a toy, an image that repeated in an infernal loop. He saw the elephant's trunk, not as an instrument of brute force, but of surgical precision, breaking the ropes that bound his mother. The intelligence, the strength, the wisdom of that creature were a silent accusation against his own pettiness and cruelty. Night approached again, bringing with it the biting cold, but Victor knew there would be no relief. The cycle of torment was complete. He was trapped between the hell of day and the purgatory of night, without hope of escape, without chance of redemption. The matriarch, with her imposing presence, was the guardian of this personal hell, the silent witness to the dismantling of a man. Victor, the magnate, the predator, was now reduced to an empty shell, at the mercy of the elements and the relentless justice of a world he had tried to dominate, but which now devoured him without pity. The desert, with its indifferent vastness, awaited the end. He was just another grain of sand, about to be swept away by the wind. The sun's descent brought not relief but a new layer of torment. The sky, which moments before was an incandescent furnace, now tinged with a deep, icy blue, dotted with stars that seemed mockingly distant. The temperature plummeted with brutal speed, transforming the suffocating heat of the day into a biting cold that seemed to penetrate his bones. Victor, already on the verge of collapse, felt the shock. His body, dehydrated and exhausted, no longer had reserves to combat this new threat. The sweat he could barely produce now evaporated, leaving a sticky, icy sensation on his skin. He began to tremble uncontrollably, violent spasms shaking his body like a puppet. His muscles, already aching from dehydration and the futile effort of crawling, now contracted in excruciating cramps. Each tremor was a stab of pain, a cruel reminder of his fragility. The sand, once a scorching bed, now radiated a damp cold that seemed to suck the last drop of warmth from his body. The night's hallucinations returned, but with a new intensity, mingling with the despair of the cold. He saw his New York penthouse, the city lights twinkling below, the fireplace lit, the cozy warmth. He reached out his hands, seeking the illusory heat, but his fingers met only the cold sand and the biting breeze. The irony was a poison. He who had tied his mother to the desert's infernal heat was now consumed by the relentless cold of the same vastness. The matriarch, an imposing silhouette against the starry sky, did not move. She remained there, a mountain of flesh and wisdom, her protective shadow over the mother, who seemed to sleep a deeper, more tranquil sleep. The elephant's eyes, even in the darkness, seemed to glow with an ancient intelligence, observing Victor with the same disarming calm as before. There was no hurry, no anger, only the infinite patience of one who understands the cycles of life and death in the desert. Victor tried to speak, but his throat was so dry that words refused to come out. A hoarse, painful groan escaped, a sound lost in the oppressive silence of the night. He tried to drag himself again, in the desperate hope of finding shelter, anything that could protect him from the invading cold. But his limbs were weak, his movements uncoordinated. He could barely move an inch, exhaustion pinning him to the sand like an invisible anchor. Victor's mind was a battlefield. The voices of his former employees, his competitors, his mother, all mingled in a chaotic chorus of accusations and laments. He saw the luxury car, his symbol of power, tumbling down the dune, no longer like a toy, but like a metal coffin, the sound of twisted metal echoing in his mind. The image of the elephant's trunk, breaking the ropes with surgical precision, repeated itself, a constant reminder of the intelligence and strength he had underestimated. Guilt, once an unbearable weight, now transformed into existential panic. He no longer saw just the fallen magnate, but the man he had become, a monster of ambition and cruelty. The image of his mother, frail and ill, but now protected by the giant, was a mirror of his own inhumanity. Her whisper, "Victor, my son," it echoed in his ears, not as a plea for forgiveness, but as a condemnation, a sadness he could not bear. He closed his eyes, but the inner darkness was even more terrifying. He saw his mother's face, young, radiant, holding him in her arms, singing lullabies. The memory, once buried under years of scorn, emerged with painful clarity, a brutal contrast to the man he had become. Tears, which he could not produce, seemed to burn his eyes from within. With each passing minute, the cold intensified. His lips were cracked and bleeding, his skin pale and clammy. He could feel his irregular heartbeat, a faint, erratic drum in his chest, a sign that his body was failing. His breathing was shallow and difficult, each inhalation an effort. He was dying, not all at once, but slowly, agonizingly, at the mercy of the elements and nature's silent justice. The matriarch, with her imposing presence, was the guardian of this purgatory. She didn't need to do anything. The desert, with its relentless extremes, was doing its work. Victor, the man who had tied up his own mother to teach her a lesson, was now bound by much greater forces, a lesson nature was giving him with a cruelty he never imagined. He was trapped between the hell of day and the purgatory of night, without hope of escape, without chance of redemption. The desert, with its indifferent vastness, awaited the end. He was just another grain of sand, about to be swept away by the wind, his existence insignificant before nature's relentless majesty. Night advanced, and with it the darkness deepened, swallowing Victor's last hopes. He felt the cold in his bones, the thirst in his throat, and the guilt in his soul. The matriarch, a silent sentinel, continued her vigil, the witness to a judgment that needed no words, only the desert's implacability. The biting air of the desert night was an invisible razor, slicing away the little energy Victor had left. Each exhalation was a faint breath of life that seemed to dissipate into the void. His lips, once cracked, now bled, and his tongue, swollen and rough, stuck to the roof of his mouth, turning any attempt to swallow into torture. Thirst was a burning fire within him, consuming him from the inside out, while the cold froze him from the outside. It was a cruel paradox, an inferno of ice and fire that the desert had orchestrated for him. Hallucinations became more vivid, more real, indistinguishably merging with reality. He saw his mother, not the frail and sick woman he had abandoned, but the young and vibrant woman of his childhood, with dark hair and a smile that lit up the world. She was there, beside him, offering him a glass of fresh, crystalline water, with droplets running down the side. Victor reached out a trembling hand, desperate to grasp the relief, but his fingers passed through the image, finding only the cold, damp sand. The disappointment was a physical blow, more painful than any cramp. Her voice, the whisper, "Victor, my son," now echoed in his mind, not as a lament, but as a mantra, a silent condemnation repeating in an infinite loop. He saw himself, the boy he once was, crying in her arms over a scraped knee, and she calmed him with kisses and gentle words. The contrast with the man he had become, the monster who had tied that same woman to the scorching sand, was a poison that corroded his soul. Shame was an overwhelming weight, heavier than the dunes that surrounded him. The sounds of the night intensified, transforming into a symphony of threats. The distant howl of a coyote seemed like a lament for his lost soul. The rustle of dry bushes, moved by the wind, sounded like approaching footsteps, invisible predators awaiting his last breath. He tried to open his eyes, but his eyelids were heavy, glued shut by exhaustion. When he managed, the darkness was almost total. Only the imposing silhouette of the elephant and the indistinct form of his mother under her protection were visible, an image of peace and security he had denied himself. The matriarch did not move, her presence an unshakable mountain of justice. Her eyes, even in the dim light, seemed fixed on him, not with anger, but with an ancestral wisdom that saw through his facade, exposing his naked and miserable soul. She was the guardian of the desert, and Victor was the intruder, the profane one, who had disturbed its balance. He was the sacrifice, the living lesson of nature's implacability. Victor tried to move his fingers, but they were numb, stiff with cold. His muscles were in constant spasms, a macabre dance of pain and exhaustion. He felt his irregular heartbeat, a faint, erratic drum in his chest, each beat a reminder that the end was near. His breathing was shallow, a thin thread that could break at any moment. He remembered his luxury penthouse, the extravagant parties, the expensive dinners, the ice-cold champagne. Images of his life of excess mingled with the brutal reality of his situation. He, the magnate who controlled empires, was now reduced to an empty shell, at the mercy of the elements, without a shred of power, without a servant to fulfill his last request. The irony was a slow poison, a psychological torture added to the physical. The luxury car, his symbol of status and power, tumbling down the dune, was no longer a distant image. He could hear the sound of twisting metal, the shattering of glass, the mute scream of his arrogance being crushed. It was the sound of his empire crumbling, of his life falling apart. The elephant's trunk, which had broken the ropes with surgical precision, was now the hand of fate, dismantling his existence with the same ease. Victor's mind was a whirlwind of regrets. He saw his mother's face, the pain in her eyes when he refused to give her money for medication. The cruelty of his words, the coldness of his heart, all came back to haunt him. He had built an empire on the pain of others, and now it was his turn to feel the pain, multiplied, amplified by loneliness and despair. He closed his eyes again, seeking darkness, but it brought no relief. Only more visions. He saw himself falling into an endless abyss, the desert's emptiness swallowing him whole. The cold intensified, and he felt a strange stupor, a numbness that began to spread from his limbs to the center of his body. It was death's icy embrace, the final stage of his agony. The matriarch, with her imposing silhouette, remained the guardian of this purgatory. She didn't need to act. The desert, with its relentless extremes, was doing its work. Victor, the man who had tied up his own mother to teach her a lesson, was now bound by much greater forces, a lesson nature was giving him with a cruelty he never imagined. He was trapped between the hell of day and the purgatory of night, without hope of escape, without chance of redemption. The desert, with its indifferent vastness, awaited the end. He was just another grain of sand, about to be swept away by the wind, his existence insignificant before nature's relentless majesty. Victor's last breath of consciousness was a silent lament, a plea for forgiveness that would never be heard. lost in the vast silence of the night. The icy cloak of the desert night tightened around Victor, every fiber of his being crying out for a warmth that would not come. The air, once a razor, was now a hammer of ice, pounding his bones, freezing the blood in his veins. His lips, long cracked and bleeding, were now hardened, his skin stretched and painful, like an ancient parchment. His tongue, swollen and rough, felt like sandpaper, and thirst, a fire consuming his essence, burned with unbearable intensity. It was a torment of extremes, an inferno of ice and fire orchestrated by nature, a cruel symphony of pain and despair. Hallucinations, once intermittent, became the new reality, more vivid, more real than the desert itself that surrounded him. He saw his mother, not the frail and sick woman he had abandoned to her fate, but the young and vibrant woman of his childhood, with dark hair, framing a face that radiated kindness, a smile that, in his distorted memory, lit up the world. She was there beside him, no longer offering water, but extending her hand to touch him, her fingers warm and soft, a balm for his frozen skin. "Victor, my son," she whispered, and the voice, once a condemnation, now seemed a lament of pain, a profound sadness that pierced his soul. He tried to move his head, tried to feel the touch, but his muscles were rigid, paralyzed by the cold and exhaustion. The image wavered, and he felt only the cold, damp sand beneath his head, a disappointment that was a physical blow, more painful than any cramp that tore at his muscles. The contrast between the boy he once was, crying in her arms over a scraped knee, and the monster who had tied that same woman to the scorching sand, was a poison that corroded his soul. Shame was an overwhelming weight, heavier than the dunes that surrounded him, denser than the darkness that swallowed him. He saw himself again, a boy, receiving kisses and gentle words, and the image merged with the vision of his mother, now protected by the giant, a cruel irony that made him tremble, not just from cold, but from an existential dread. He remembered his luxury penthouse, the extravagant parties, the expensive dinners, the ice-cold champagne trickling down his throat. Images of his life of excess mingled with the brutal reality of his situation, creating a torturous dissonance. He, the magnate who controlled empires, was now reduced to an empty shell, at the mercy of the elements, without a shred of power, without a servant to fulfill his last request. The irony was a slow poison, a psychological torture added to the physical, corroding his sanity. Victor's mind was a whirlwind of regrets, a vortex of guilt and despair. He saw his mother's face, the pain in her eyes when he refused to give her money for medication, the cruelty of his words, the coldness of his heart, all came back to haunt him, not as memories, but as living presences, specters that surrounded him. He had built an empire on the pain of others, and now it was his turn to feel the pain, multiplied, amplified by loneliness and despair, a pain he never imagined possible. The stupor, once a cold current, was now an icy river that flooded Victor, rising from his numb feet, passing through his rigid legs, up to his torso that could barely breathe. The numbness was a perverse relief, a veil that spread over the excruciating pain, but also pulled him away from reality, pushing him into a limbo between life and death. His eyes, heavy and almost closed, barely registered the indistinct shapes of the night. Darkness was not just the absence of light, but a palpable, dense entity that seemed to suck the last remnant of warmth from his body. His mother's hallucinations, once fragmented, now solidified into an almost real presence. She was there, no longer the distant image, but bent over him, her dark hair falling like a cascade, her face soft and worried. Her lips moved, and Victor could hear her voice, clear as a bell, but laden with a sadness that was a weight in his chest. "Victor, my son." Why did you do this? The question was not an accusation, but a lament, an echo of his own guilt that resonated in every fiber of his dying being. He tried to answer, tried to reach out to touch her face, to beg forgiveness, but his limbs were trapped, his muscles paralyzed. The saliva in his mouth was a paste, and his tongue, swollen and rough, could not form a single word. His mother's image wavered, mingling with the imposing silhouette of the matriarch elephant, who remained a few feet away, a mountain of flesh and ancestral wisdom. The giant's eyes, even in the dim light, seemed to glow with a light of their own, an intelligence that judged him without words, without anger, only with nature's relentless coldness. The elephant was the guardian of truth, the mirror that reflected the monstrosity of his actions. Victor saw the cruel irony. His mother, whom he had denied comfort and healing, was now under the protection of a creature he could never have imagined, while he, the tormentor, was consumed by the same nature she had embraced. The cold deepened, turning his bones into needles of ice, each heartbeat a painful effort, a faint and irregular drum announcing the end. His breathing was a whisper, a thin thread that could break at any moment. He felt his body tremble uncontrollably, spasms that were not from cold, but from an agony that refused to yield, a last macabre dance before silence. Thirst, once a fire, was now a dull ache, a black hole in his throat that not even hallucinations of water could fill. The voices of the desert intensified, no longer just coyote laments, but a chorus of condemnation. He heard the cries of his former employees, mercilessly fired, the pleas of his crushed competitors, the whispers of all those he had trampled in his ruthless ascent. Justice! Cruel! Monster! The words mingled with the rustle of dry bushes and the howl of the wind, creating an infernal symphony that echoed in his mind. He tried to close his ears, but the sounds were internal, part of his own torment. Shame was an overwhelming weight, heavier than the dunes that surrounded him. He saw himself again, a boy, crying in his mother's arms over a scraped knee, receiving kisses and gentle words. The contrast with the man who had tied that same woman to the scorching sand was a poison that corroded his soul, a wound that would never heal. The image of his luxury penthouse, the extravagant parties, the expensive dinners, the ice-cold champagne, all mingled with the brutal reality of his situation, creating a torturous dissonance. He, the magnate who controlled empires, was now reduced to an empty shell, at the mercy of the elements, without a shred of power, without a servant to fulfill his last request. The irony was a slow poison. A psychological torture added to the physical, corroding his sanity. Victor's last breath of consciousness, a silent lament, had been lost in the vast silence of the night, dissolving his form, erasing his existence. But the end was not a switch, but a slow fade, a prolonged agony that refused to yield. The stupor, once an icy river, had now transformed into a bottomless ocean, rising, swallowing every part of his being. The numbness was almost complete, a thick veil that muffled the excruciating pain, but also isolated him from any remnant of life, any hope. His lungs, once desperate for air, now barely expanded, an almost imperceptible movement, a last gasp from the biological machine that was miserably failing. Hallucinations, however, did not subside. Instead, they became sharper, more real, as if his mind, in its last throes, sought a final truth, a final torture. His mother was there again, no longer a distant image, but a palpable presence bent over him, her dark hair falling like a cascade. She did not speak, only looked, her eyes moist, her sadness profound, a well of sorrow that Victor felt in his own soul. He saw himself, a small boy, hiding behind her, seeking protection from a world that seemed too big. The memory was a dagger, twisting in the wound of his cruelty. How could he have transformed that unconditional love into contempt? How could he have tied the hands that cradled him, the arms that protected him? The contrast was a poison that corroded what remained of his sanity. The matriarch elephant, a dark mountain against the starry sky, remained motionless a few feet away. Her eyes, beacons of ancestral wisdom, seemed to penetrate the darkness, seeing not only Victor's dying body, but his soul in agony. She was the silent witness, the relentless judge, the personification of nature he had defied and which now claimed him. There was no anger in her gaze, only the coldness of an undeniable truth, the inevitability of a destiny forged by his own hands. The elephant was the guardian of truth, the mirror that reflected the monstrosity of his actions, and Victor was forced to confront this image until the end. The desert, his stage and his tomb, intensified its symphony of condemnation. The wind howled, no longer as a distant sound, but as a chorus of voices, each one a name Victor had trampled in his ruthless ascent. Traitor, selfish, murderer. The words mingled with the rustle of dry bushes, the scratching of shifting sand, as if the very ground were whispering its judgment. He tried to close his ears, but the sounds were internal, reverberating in his skull, an echo chamber for his worst fears and regrets. Thirst was now a searing pain, a desert within another. His tongue, a piece of wood, stuck to the roof of his mouth. Every attempt to swallow was a painful spasm, a cruel reminder of the water he had denied his mother, of the life he had dried up. He saw glasses of ice-cold water, overflowing pitchers, crystalline rivers, all illusions dancing before his eyes, mocking his agony, making the torture even more unbearable. His body, once a temple of power and control, was now a prison of flesh and bone, miserably failing. The tremors had ceased, replaced by a cadaverous rigidity that spread. His fingers, once agile for closing deals and signing million-dollar checks, were now curled, immobile, like inert claws. His heart, a faint and irregular drum, beat slower and slower, each pulsation a farewell, a last effort before silence. The image of his luxury car, the symbol of his empire, collapsing down the dune, returned with brutal clarity. He could feel the impact, the metal twisting, the glass shattering into 1,000 pieces, each fragment a piece of his life, of his identity torn apart. It was the perfect metaphor for his downfall, swift, violent, irreversible. The elephant's trunk, which had broken the ropes with surgical precision, was now the hand of fate, dismantling his existence with the same ease, with the same indifference. Victor, the man who considered himself invincible, was now reduced to nothing more than a grain of sand, about to be swept away by the wind. His mind, a whirlwind of regrets, desperately sought an escape, a moment of redemption, but there was none. The final darkness was no longer a threat, but a promise, an icy embrace that promised an end to all pain, all guilt. He felt one last spasm, a final tremor that coursed through his body like an electric shock. His eyes, almost closed, opened a little wider, focusing on the matriarch's silhouette. For an instant, he thought he saw a tear trickle from the giant's eyes, or perhaps it was just the moon's gleam reflected in the moisture. But no, it was indifference, the relentless majesty of nature that does not weep for tyrants, but merely absorbs them back into the earth. Victor's last breath was a whisper, a name he could barely form. Mother. It was not a plea for forgiveness, but a recognition, a return to the origin, to the only true love he had ever had and destroyed. The word was lost on the wind, as fragile as his life. Darkness, dense and absolute, finally claimed him. There was no light at the end of the tunnel, only emptiness, silence. The stupor became complete, the numbness eternal. Victor no longer felt the cold, nor the thirst, nor the pain. He no longer saw the hallucinations, no longer heard the voices. His existence, once so loud and imposing, dissolved into the silent vastness of the desert. He was, finally, one with the sand, one with the wind, one with nothing. Victor's empire had fallen, and with it Victor himself. The lesson was complete. The desert, with its millennia-old patience, had closed its cycle. The silence that followed Victor's last breath was no ordinary silence. It was not the absence of sound, but the overwhelming presence of a vacuum, an abyss that swallowed everything he had been. The wind's howl seemed to calm. The sands ceased their whispering, as if nature itself held its breath, witnessing the end of an era, the collapse of a tyranny. Victor, the magnate who had dominated the world with his booming voice and iron will, was now merely a forgotten murmur, an insignificant stain on the desert's vast tapestry. The matriarch, a living statue of wisdom and power, remained motionless for a long moment. Her eyes, which had witnessed centuries of births and deaths, of droughts and floods, of human cruelty and life's resilience, fixed on the inert body. There was no triumph in her gaze, no vengeance, only the coldness of impartial justice, the acceptance of a cycle that had completed itself. She was the guardian of balance, and the desert, her instrument, had done its work. The lesson was etched in the sand, indelible as the stars above. Slowly, with a dignity that defied gravity itself, the giant turned. Her movements were deliberate, each step a declaration of purpose. She was in no hurry, for time to her was an illusion, a human convention. Her focus was now elsewhere, on a life that had been spared, on a heart that still beat, weak but resilient. Victor's mother, still lying on the cold sand, began to emerge from a sleep induced by exhaustion and shock. The stupor that had enveloped her began to dissipate, bringing with it a painful awareness. She felt the cold penetrating her bones, the stiffness of her muscles, the dryness in her throat. But above all, she felt an absence. The absence of the ropes that bound her, the absence of the excruciating pain in her wrists and ankles, and the absence of her son's cruel presence. Opening her eyes with difficulty, she saw the imposing silhouette of the elephant. It was not a threatening sight, but a comforting presence, a wall of protection against the hostile vastness. The matriarch approached, not with the force she had used to hurl the car, but with surprising delicacy. Her trunk, once an instrument of destruction, extended gently, touching the woman's wrinkled face. It was a touch of recognition, of empathy, a silent communication that transcended species barriers. The mother let out a faint groan, a mixture of pain and relief. She tried to move, but her body seemed to have become a heavy burden. The elephant, sensing her difficulty, lowered her head, and with the tip of her trunk, gently nudged the woman's shoulder, helping her turn onto her side, to find a less uncomfortable position. It was a gesture of care, of compassion, that contrasted brutally with the indifference and cruelty she had suffered at the hands of her own son. The first lights of dawn began to paint the horizon, transforming the night sky into a kaleidoscope of orange and purple hues. With the light came brutal clarity. Victor's mother looked at the spot where her son had tied her. The ropes were gone, and then her eyes moved, sweeping the landscape to the dune where Victor's luxury car had tumbled. The sight was shocking. The vehicle, once a symbol of power and ostentation, was now a twisted mass of metal and glass. Unrecognizable, a skeleton of its former glory. The impact of the image was a punch to the gut, a silent confirmation that something of epic proportions had occurred. She did not see Victor. There was no sign of him. But the absence, the silence that hung over the spot, and the imposing presence of the elephant were sufficient evidence. A wave of emotions hit her: shock, sadness, a perverse relief, and above all, a profound sense of emptiness. Her son, the boy she had loved unconditionally, The man who had betrayed and humiliated her was no more. The desert had claimed its price. The matriarch let out a low rumble, a sound not of warning, but of farewell. It was a sound that seemed to echo the very voice of the desert, an ancestral lament that celebrated life and mourned loss, but which, above all, affirmed the natural order of things. She moved away slowly, her majestic silhouette diminishing as the sun climbed in the sky. She did not look back. Her mission was complete. Justice had been served, and life, in its most vulnerable form, had been protected. Victor's mother stood there, alone again, but in a different way, no longer bound, no longer imprisoned by her son's cruelty, but free and terribly alone. The rising sun bathed the desert in a golden glow, revealing the landscape's relentless beauty. She felt the cool sand beneath her hands, the gentle breeze on her face. The world, despite everything, continued, and she somehow did too. The physical pain was intense, but the pain of the soul, the wound of betrayal, was even deeper. Yet there was a small flame of hope, a spark of gratitude for the life that had been restored to her, however fragile. The desert, which had been her hell, had become her sanctuary, and the elephant, her silent savior. Victor's lesson had been learned, not by him, but by those who witnessed his fall. And now the desert awaited the next chapter, the next story the sand would hold in its millennia-old silence. The sun, now an incandescent disk on the horizon, bathed the desert in a golden glow, but for her, it was a furnace igniting. The sand, once cool, began to warm beneath her fingers, promising the torture of midday. Victor's mother, a frail and aged figure, felt like a ship adrift in an ocean of dunes. Freedom, which should have been a balm, was now a heavy burden, mingled with physical pain and the perplexity of her new reality. Her body cried out for water, for rest, for relief. Every muscle seemed to have turned to stone, every joint to coarse sand. Her throat scraped, her mouth dry, an echo of the thirst that had consumed her son. A cruel irony, she thought, that the same thirst that had led him to ruin now threatened her own existence. But there was a fundamental difference. She had not chosen this punishment. She was the victim, not the executioner. The image of the twisted car, a metallic scar on the dune, was a vivid reminder of the violence that had erupted in the night. Victor was gone. The boy she had cradled, the man she had loved despite his flaws, the monster who had tied her to die. All these versions now dissolved into the vastness of the desert, reduced to dust just like him. There were no tears. The well had long run dry, replaced by an exhaustion that weighed more than the sand itself. There was only an emptiness, a deafening silence that filled the space where once had been the tumult of her love and her suffering. She tried to sit up, a Herculean effort that left her dizzy and gasping. The world spun for an instant, sky and sand mingling in a blur. When the vertigo passed, she found herself propped on her elbows, her gaze fixed on the horizon. There was nothing, only dunes upon dunes, stretching as far as the eye could see, a relentless landscape that offered no refuge, no promise. Where to go? How to survive? A faint moan escaped her cracked lips. The pain in her wrists and ankles, though the ropes were gone, was a phantom memory, a persistent burning. Her skin was raw, marked by cruelty. But the physical pain was secondary to the pain of the soul, to the wound of betrayal that would never fully heal. She had lost everything, her son, her dignity, her hope, or perhaps not everything. Life was still in her, fragile as a silk thread but present, suddenly a movement at the periphery of her vision. She blinked, thinking it a mirage, another of the illusions the desert loved to conjure. But no, the massive silhouette of the matriarch, whom she thought had departed forever, was there again, not approaching but observing, at a respectful distance, as if waiting. Her wise eyes, which had witnessed Victor's end, now seemed to assess the woman's fragility, the spark of life that still persisted. There was no fear in her, only a strange sense of recognition, almost familiarity. The elephant was not a threat. She was the very incarnation of desert justice, a silent guardian. The matriarch let out a low rumble, a sound not of warning, but of a call, an invitation. She turned her head slightly to the east and then took a slow step, as if indicating a path. Victor's mother understood. It was an invitation to follow, a promise of guidance. But how? Her body barely responded. The elephant, as if reading her thoughts, took another step, then another, maintaining distance, but always with her head turned back, confirming she was being followed. It was a patience only millennia-old nature could possess. With an agonizing effort, the woman managed to drag herself to a sitting position, and then, using her hands for support, tried to stand. Her legs trembled, her knees buckled, but she refused to fall. The image of the elephant, majestic and unshakable, was her anchor, her only hope. She took a hesitant step, then another. Each movement a battle against pain and weakness. The sand was an obstacle, yielding beneath her feet, making every advance difficult. The matriarch continued her slow, steady pace, never straying too far, never leaving her behind. It was a silent dance between human fragility and nature's indomitable strength. The sun climbed, relentless, and the heat began to press down. But the giant's presence seemed to ward off hopelessness. There was a purpose now, a destiny to be reached. She thought of Victor, not with hatred, but with a profound melancholy. He had lost himself, consumed by his own cruelty. She, on the other hand, was being guided, rescued by a creature he would have despised. The lesson was clear. True strength lay not in power and control, but in compassion and the interconnectedness of life. Hours dragged on, each an eternity. Thirst was a constant agony, but the sight of the matriarch ahead was a balm for her soul. She stumbled, fell, but always found the strength to rise, driven by a will she didn't know she possessed. The elephant at one point stopped and waited, her trunk raised, sniffing the air, as if searching for something, or as if encouraging her. Lie. As the sun began its descent, painting the sky with fiery hues, the matriarch stopped. Ahead, amidst a cluster of rocks, there was a small rock formation, and in it, a dark crevice. And beside it, what appeared to be a small oasis, a muddy puddle of water, but water nonetheless. The sight was a miracle, a mirage materialized. Victor's mother collapsed onto the sand, tears finally streaming down her dusty face, not from sadness, but from overwhelming relief. The matriarch approached slowly, and with her trunk, gently touched the woman's forehead, a gesture of farewell, of mission accomplished. She let out a final rumble, a sound that seemed to bless the spot, and then turned and disappeared into the vastness of the desert as silently as she had arrived. The woman crawled to the puddle, ignoring the sand and dirt, and drank. The water was warm, earthy, but it was life. Every sip was a promise, a rebirth. She lay down in the shade of the rocks, exhausted, but with a peace she hadn't felt in years. The desert had taken her son, but it had given her back to herself. The lesson was complete, and she, the survivor, was ready for the next chapter, not of power and cruelty, but of humility and gratitude. The desert's silence embraced her, no longer as a threat, but as a sanctuary. The water, warm and earthy, was more than a liquid. It was a promise, a baptism. Each sip washed away not only the thirst of her body, but also the barrenness of her soul. Lying in the shade of the rocks, her body exhausted and her mind at truce, Victor's mother felt the pulse of life return, slow but undeniable. The oasis, a small muddy puddle and a few stunted plants, was her sanctuary, a miracle amidst the relentless vastness. The desert, which hours before had been an executioner, now whispered secrets of resilience and rebirth. The sun continued its descent, painting the sky with shades of orange and purple, a grandiose spectacle she had never stopped to appreciate. In her previous life, trapped in Victor's orbit, sunsets were merely markers of time, the end of a day of worries and the beginning of a night of insomnia. Now, every color, every nuance was a gift, a silent celebration of existence. She closed her eyes, feeling the cool approaching night breeze, a balm for her burned skin. Physical pain was still there, a constant reminder of the cruelty she had suffered, but it was a pain that could be borne, a pain that anchored her to reality, to her own survival. The image of Victor, or what remained of him and his luxury car, persisted in her mind. There was no triumph in his fall, only a deep and complex sadness. He had been her son, her flesh and blood, and yet he had transformed into something unrecognizable, consumed by a darkness she could not reach. His death was the end of an era, the final period of a story of distorted love and corrupted power. There were no tears now, only the grim acceptance that some destinies are forged by one's own hand, and that not even a mother's unconditional love can divert the course of a soul determined to self-destruction. The desert had executed its own justice, impersonal and relentless, and Victor, in his arrogance, had refused to heed its warnings. The matriarch elephant, her silent savior, was the personification of the desert's ancestral wisdom. She did not act out of vengeance, but from a deeper imperative, the protection of life, the restoration of balance. Her gentle touch on the woman's forehead, a gesture of farewell and blessing, was a reminder that compassion and interconnectedness were the true forces of the universe, not money or control. The elephant had fulfilled her mission, not only freeing the woman from her ropes, but also from the captivity of her own pain and despair. She had shown a path, not to civilization, but to inner redemption. As dusk fell, stars began to emerge, dotting the sky like diamonds on dark velvet. She had never seen so many stars, so bright, so close. The desert's silence was filled only by the distant hum of insects and the beat of her own heart. She was alone, yes, but not helpless. Freedom, once an abstract concept, was now a palpable reality, mingled with the fear of the unknown, but also with a strange, renewed excitement. What would she do now? Where would she go? The answer did not come immediately, but a certainty began to form in her chest. She had survived, she had witnessed the fall of a personal empire and the rise of a new hope. The desert's lessons were clear: humility before nature, gratitude for small miracles, the resilience of the human spirit. She was no longer Victor's mother, the subjugated and humiliated woman. She was a survivor, a witness, a reborn soul. With the first light of dawn, which tinged the horizon a pale pink, she stood. Her body still ached, but there was a new energy, a silent determination. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew she would no longer be the same. The oasis was a starting point, not a final destination. She looked to the east, in the direction the matriarch had pointed, and then to the west, where the sun would begin its daily journey. The desert was vast, but she was no longer lost. She had found her own way, guided by the memory of a gentle touch and the strength of her own will. Victor's mother, now just a woman in the desert, took a hesitant step, then another. She had no map, no plan, but she had something more valuable: belief in herself and in life's ability to find a way, even in the most adverse conditions. The desert had taken her son, but it had given her back to herself, a stronger, wiser, more grateful version. The lesson was complete. The desert's silence embraced her, no longer as a threat, but as a sanctuary, a stage for the next chapter of a life that, against all odds, had chosen to continue.